Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the DME Freeze community. Happy Thursday to you wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. By now, you know it as the best, most innovative, and greatest learning webinar there is in the evaluation field, and particularly in peacebuilding evaluation. Just in case you've forgotten, my name is Jack Farrell, and I'm the DME for Peace Project Manager based here in Washington, DC within Search for Common Ground. Today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Sukanya Potter, Senior Lecturer in Defence and Security Studies at King's College London, who's going to lead a discussion on reflexive peacebuilding, legacies, institutional learning, and reflection. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once you reach the question and answer section of today's discussion. I'm now going to hand over to today's guest. Sukanya, you are very welcome to the Thursday Talks, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Jack. It's really quite exciting to be able to share my research, which I've been doing for more than 3 years now, and also in collaboration with Search for Common Ground. So it is all my pleasure really to be here. In terms of the focus of today's talk, I think it's interesting to talk about reflexive peace building, because somehow within the DNA of the peace building industry, it's so much driven by short-term, quick impact, themes which keep moving from month to month, year to year, that we rarely have, the time or the willingness to sit back and look back and think reflexively. In terms of the conceptual basis for this, I'm looking at this concept of peace building legacy. Simply put, it is about looking at the long-term effects of peace-building interventions. Now, most people will say conceptually that's a very fuzzy topic, because there are within a post-conflict country, which is the context in which I work across Africa, there are not any single intervention, but several interventions which work in parallel. And therefore, when you think about the long-term effects, 10 years, 15 years down the line, when relief to peace building to kind of development, the different modes of operation, it's very difficult to attribute any changes, whether in behaviors, whether in terms of attitudes of people, to a single intervention. I think that has been a major challenge conceptually. Methodologically, when we think about the concept of peace building legacy, again, within our current suite of monitoring and evaluation tools, these are all short-term, quickly trying to look back and see what a certain project over 9 months or 12 months has delivered. And that is what is built into donor requirements in terms of funding and reporting. And therefore, very rarely do we, within the peace building sort of field, think about how can we develop the tools which enable us to look at the long-term picture. If we've worked in a country, if an organization has worked in a country over 10, 15 years, rarely do they have the resources, the time, even the space, to just sit back and think, look back, so to speak. And then, of course, there is a question of empirical evidence. What kinds of countries do you want to look at? What kind of projects do you want to look at? So there's a lot of fuzziness in terms of the idea of legacy. So to make this work, I approached Search for Common Ground, Saji Prelis, Director of Children and Youth Programs, with this project. And we were very fortunate to receive some funding from the British Academy to enable us to start this work. I worked closely with them in identifying 2 cases, 2 countries where Search has worked for more than 10, 15 years. The first was Macedonia, now called North Macedonia, where they have piloted an early years intervention called Mosaic, and it has run since 1997. In 2012, it was adopted and institutionalized by the government's education department as part of its preschool sort of offering. And of course, Sierra Leone, which since 2001 has seen very many different types of interventions, but the focus there was on media-led peace building, on radio, and also on community-based, sort of the community peace building unit, which worked alongside. I worked with people like Wilma Milchev in Macedonia, the Talking Drum Studio, their team in Sierra Leone, and also with the institutional learning and development team within Search. Now, in terms of the focus of the question that we were looking at, as I've mentioned already, we were looking at the long-term effects of interventions in these two countries run by Search. So it was one organization trying to, dive into its institutional memory, trying to, look at more significantly the impact on children and youth. So it was less about participants only, but I will tell you shortly about what the different focus was in terms of the concept of legacy. Now, this involved fieldwork in Sierra Leone during April and May 2017, in Macedonia during August and September 2017, and also a lot of archival ethnography, which is one of the methodologies I've used here, and which could be very helpful for M&E people who are looking at the long-term kind of perspective. Now, in terms of the concept of peace building legacy, I was able to operationalize it through 3 different parameters. The first was looking at norm resonance and retention. So we know very well that within the peace building industry, if I can call it that, various projects and programs are conduits for transmitting certain values, certain ideas, certain ways of doing things. They are also mechanisms through which messages are, distributed to populations who have been affected by war, who are coming out of a lot of social upheaval. And these values, can sometimes have strong resonance with the local context, given the focus on sustaining peace within the UN, given the focus on local ownership, and or sometimes they can be very top down, and they can have very little resonance, is probably the best word, in terms of local values and local ideas of how things should be done. So trying to understand how these values are introduced through, whether in the Mosaic case, this early years intervention program, what happened so many years after these children had gone through the program, how, did they retain these values? Did their families and communities remember any of the values that were transmitted through the Mosaic model? And also in case of Sierra Leone, through the various radio programs that we'll shortly see. The other thing I wanted to look at was what types of programs have more stronger legacy? Do certain types of programs, like educational programs, are they more easier to institutionalize? Yeah, are they easier in terms of institutionalization processes? And this was the second sort of dimension at which the concept of legacy was focused. So are certain projects more readily transferable in terms of knowledge transfer, taken over by national actors, by government agencies? And how can we try and build the sustainability loop? How can we engage with not only just superficial local ownership agendas, but much more deep-rooted transfer agendas through which you have donor projects built in to transfer knowledge to national organizations. And I know there is a lot of work which is happening in this field, but I think often it can be sidelined because of the nature of quick impact and short-termism. The third dimension, of course, is what can organizations, the peace building organizations themselves learn from multi-year programming in a country? So how do they develop the capacity, the resources to be able to adopt this legacy perspective? And methodologically, I think being able to make use of metadata, using a meta-ethnographic approach, archives, as in being more systematic about archiving internal communications, all sorts of documents, from project proposals to interim reports to evaluations, internal and external, to even undertaking post-closure evaluations. When a project has finished, having some money so that the institutional learning team can go back a few years later and having those follow-up loops, because we often just forget about beneficiaries once project has closed, or we move on to new sites or new communities where we want to sort of work with on different projects. So this is the third dimension of the legacy piece that I looked at. Now, just a quick word on meta-ethnography, because this is a fascinating field, and I don't think it is being used sufficiently by practitioners in the field, because there is a lot of metadata which simply, in terms of adaptation, in terms of local level solutions to different types of problems, all sorts of projects, project implementation experiences, practitioners will know they require local level adaptation. But those small sort of processes are often lost. They're not documented or sort of maintained in a way that there is a very easily accessible archive within the organization that is easily transferable, that is maybe made digital so that it can be more readily accessed, and it can help us to not only have this story along the purpose, like 10 years, 15 years of working in a country, what has been the big picture? What is the purpose of our programming for 10, 15 years? What are we giving back? And it's not just mini successes that, this project has been very successful. We've created, jobs for 100 women, or, those small success stories, but I think we should have the big picture. And it also helps us, this kind of methodology helps us to have the ability to analyze and to look back at the past records, to to think about changing and revisiting the theory of change, and also to have somewhat of a link between multiple projects, if that is the way in which we are progressing, any organization is progressing with multiple projects. So that's a very effective way of looking at the legacy issue. Now, quickly, in terms of the two country studies, and they were quite a contrasting sort of take on the peace building legacy issue. So in Macedonia, which was one of the successes in terms of in the Balkans not having a conflict for almost 10 years after it gained independence, and then having this short conflict between the Albanian and the Macedonian sort of groups. But the main thing is that in Macedonia, again, in terms of the values, norms being transmitted through peace building projects, very much, within the Balkans, there's been a push by the European Union in terms of, certain conditionalities of being able to meet those standards before they can join. So it's part of that bigger picture in terms of the types of liberal norms that are being transmitted. But it is also a context which is highly segregated, which is a divided society, where you have, education is monolingual. Each group is interested in having education in its own language. So the Albanians want to be educated in their own language. So in this kind of a context, and that's Lake Ohrid, by the way, beautiful. In this sort of context, the mosaic kindergartens funded by the Swiss government, piloted in 3 areas in 1997, brings this idea that no, we are going to focus on intercultural communication. We are going to introduce instruction in both languages, if it's Albanian and Macedonian, later also in Turkish, for example. So other groups were being integrated. So children from all groups would play in the same sort of kindergarten, and it had excellent facilities. So that was a great draw in terms of parents wanting to send their children. But eventually what we see is that, yes, there is great expansion. It becomes institutionalized in 2012, because that was the project's aim right from the beginning, that we want to hand this over to the government. We want to make it into a model which is adopted by the government in terms of its preschool education provision. But one of the things that I was able to track through much of the meta-ethnography and the archival ethnography that I did, there were 1,000+ children who have gone through the mosaic kindergartens. But in terms of the evolution of the project, there were so many internal and external shocks, right? So it was not an easy ride, and most project practitioners would know that it never is. But it is very much a politicized process, particularly with gaining employment for teachers, a dilution of quality because you have donor funding getting cut back, and more sort of national reliance on national resources, and which means that the quality of resources goes down. There's more standardization in terms of procedure, in terms of monitoring. So long story short, one of the things that we take away is that, right, you have this excellent model which works, somewhat adapted to the local context, because of resource issues. But what about the values around intercultural, sort of understanding, socialization? How strong are these? Now, very interesting finding is that it relates to geographic location, right? So when you have places like Debar, which has very strong ties between the different groups, the Albanian groups and the Macedonian group, in those areas, because families socialize with each other, the alumni network are peers and they have this longer continuity of socialization and therefore remember much more of the Mosaic values compared to places like Skopje, the capital, where there is less socialization between different groups, and therefore they lose those values much more quickly. And the other thing is that in terms of the bigger sort of social transformation, that is there more intercultural dialogue or socialization? No, that's very limited. So despite the very good work, the success in terms of Mosaic, in terms of it becoming institutionalized, but we find that the theory of change needed to be revisited, that we needed to kind of understand whether within this context a sort of intercultural model would work or not. And also after preschool, from primary school onto secondary school and high school, they are being taught in monolingual instruction, which again is sort of reversing the effects of Mosaic. Now quickly, I don't know how much time I have, but so in terms of learning and reflection, one of the things I found was there were positive evaluations. There was very good institutional memory was being preserved very well. We had continuity in terms of staff, great deal of perseverance. But it was very difficult to actually find these children who were part of Mosaic. There was no database. There were certain events, but it was very dispersed. It was very difficult to actually track down the people who taken part. And I think simple steps like this, being able to, organize, follow up, being able to track, and in today's digital, sort of software where we can use, technology to our advantage, this should be relatively straightforward. Now, the other case study was Sierra Leone, and here too we find that media and radio was the main sort of mode through which different values, and here I have a timeline of all the different radio programs that were run between 2000 2017, and you will see visually it's very easy to capture that you have all these different types of liberal values being transmitted, sensitization, messaging from, human rights, gender, reconciliation, to accountability, democracy promotion, equality, youth rights, all sorts of values being promoted. But one of the things which, few people are reflecting on is, are there connections between the different projects? Are there different theories of change, kind of aligned to each other? And I wasn't sure breadth and scope of the projects. It was very difficult to understand how strongly, certain values I thought had stronger resonance. For example, issues around children's rights, human rights, because there had been a local push towards, challenging the gerontocratic, the control by the elders within Sierra Leone. So I think that had strong resonance. But there were also examples of countering violent extremism or HIV/AIDS or things like that, which were not strong or which were not particularly the issues that children and youth were concerned about. And the negative fallout could have been that by pouring a lot of donor money from a regional perspective on issues such as countering violent extremism, they were actually encouraging you to take these issues seriously. The other thing in terms of institutionalization, what I found is that there was a push towards creating community radio stations to try and build their capacity. to try and create sustainability on their part. But it was a big problem because they simply did not, there was this continued dependence, and in Sierra Leone there is a general dependence on NGOs and donors in terms of services. But there was, the dependence could not be overcome. That there was no initiative through which you could kind of link it to a more national sort of project. Was it part of any sort of national media project, or make it part of all the good work, the great brand that TDS is? It was very difficult to somehow institutionalize and adapt that to the local environment. There were lots of local radio stations which were modeled on TDS, which were replicating what they were doing, so that was a great compliment. But I don't think that there was any sort of long-term perspective towards, right, all these projects, they need to fit into this this bigger picture. This is our legacy, this is what we're going to leave behind. So I think in terms of these two countries, a couple of things. The first is that in certain countries you will find it, and in Sierra Leone I did find it much more difficult to access institutional memory because there was higher staff turnover, there were multiple programs, media was only one component, there were several other things they were supporting, working with more than one partner. The other thing is, I think media programs by their very nature, and Serge does a lot of media related work, it's very difficult to look at the longer term effects because they're so dispersed. It's very difficult to collate them. And how do you measure change in behaviors? It can be at a very abstract level. Yes, lots of women participate, in elections. Lots of women, now stand up and say, right, we have a say in decision making, more willing to be interviewed, more willing to speak. Youth feel empowered, all at a very generic level. Very difficult to attribute, to radio, to sensitization. And also, I think sometimes, and this is not just the Sierra Leone case, it could be with so many other countries, that you tend to prolong presence, beyond what is ideal. And it relates to local jobs, it relates to, being able to get some sort of funding to, continue to survive. But I think it's really important to have a very strict and sometimes be quite ruthless about exiting and planning exit strategies early, so that you're in a much better position to have the perspective, right? This is time to leave. What are we going to hand over? Who are we? Our national partners in a position? Is exit good for them? Can we work together? And finally, also about post-closure evaluation. I think that is an area which is opening up. We know organizations like Every Child, for example, which have handed over their resources to national partners, and which has also undertaken a post-closure evaluations a few years after it closed down its operations. But I think this is an area where M&E experts really need to invest a great deal, because we need to be able to develop the methodologies, look at the metadata, look at ethnographic methods through which we can look back and say, right, this is our legacy, this is our footprint. These are our big wins, and this is what we are going to take forward. And these are the things where we didn't really do very well, and we are not going to replicate this process again. So that's where I'm at. And in terms of learning and evaluation, I think in terms of learning and reflection, being able to invest in post-closure evaluations, looking at less is more, doing more in depth rather than a whole lot of different projects, looking at the theory of change for every project, trying to tweak it along the way, and trying to strike a balance between chasing donor funding and having a bigger sort of picture in terms of what is the long-term purpose, what is the contribution going to be 10, 15 years from now. And I think archiving actively, all the institutional memory, the documentations, the internal communications, proposal reports, evaluations, all sorts of bits and pieces which get lost, once staff leave, and being much more, sort of technology driven on these issues. And finally, also having a clear picture about what to hand over, not just capacity building, but what can be left behind with national partners or with the government or with departments that organizations are working with. And that's that, Jack. I know there's just so much. I'm like an encyclopedia of knowledge these days on these issues, but thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Sukanya. You've obviously given us a lot of information, and I hope we'll be able to post the slides alongside the recording on DME for Peace later today. Yeah, I think you made a couple of really interesting points just towards the end as you were concluding. One of the things I think that peace building organizations have really grappled with in the last, since our inception 40 years ago, it's this idea of designing for enduring change. I think at Search, we've really learned that, if we want to actually create enduring change, locally led processes are key to that. I also think that understanding the impact of our interventions is huge. So yes, we can understand the effects of an activity. A certain activity creates this level of change, but we need to look beyond the activity level. We need to look at the full ecosystem of the context within which we're working to understand our long-term impact. And then one point before I move on to sort of the audience here, I'm sure eager to ask many questions, is I think the planning for exit is a great point. I think making that intentional and deliberate from the get-go is really important for these locally led processes. And actually, as a side note, if any of the listeners today are in Washington, D.C., there's an event at Interaction regarding stopping a success, which is discussing exit strategies and discussing how international NGOs have successfully departed from local and handed over to sort of local practitioners. It's being held by Interaction. I think there are speakers from Peace Direct, CDA Collaborative Learning Projects, and the Institutional Learning Team at Search for Common Ground. To our audience, thank you for your patience. We're now going to open up for questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function on GoToWebinar, where you can type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon on your GoToWebinar dashboard. This will raise your hand and allow me to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. And we always love to hear your voice. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace, so that those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion. So again, I'm going to use my moderator's privilege here to kickstart our discussion portion today, Sukanya. And one of the questions I have is, while it's easy to often find causation or correlation between a specific project activity and some behavioral outcomes, I was wondering your approach with regards to long-term mapping of this change on a participant level. Did you compare it against any existing data sources or trend data on the specific context? So for example, an intervention happens in sort of a part of Sierra Leone or in Macedonia, and you map the sort of the conflict data for those contexts over time, how the intervention changed that. I'm just thinking of the Armed Conflict Location Event Data Project, ACLED, or any employment data or levels of investment in regions. Were you able to map your research against that?
No, Jack, I think what was relevant is to look at, in both these cases, we were looking at peace building over many years. So some of the points which were helpful for me, not quite data sets that are, available publicly, but looking at the various monitoring and evaluation reports that have been produced across the different projects. So for example, in Sierra Leone, you had a radio as the main tool, and you could see and you could map that over the various years, the audience in terms of the listener surveys that were available, that the audience was shrinking. And this was also a time when you could see that there was a change because radio was no longer the go-to in terms of getting information, and people were able to access the internet. And there were other ways, through text messaging or particularly the internet boom, which enabled this shift in terms of the listeners. And therefore, when we think about messaging or the use of radio as a tool through which you want to influence people's thinking and people's behaviors, I think this was one of the index which was helpful. In Macedonia, I think I was able to work with some of the schools, some of the kindergartens, and the teachers who were, sort of like they were continuous in the sense that, they'd been with the program for so many years. So they were a source of, almost encyclopedic knowledge in terms of what they observed year on year, and whether in certain localities, as I mentioned in Debar, for example, it was much more in cohesive. The social ties were much stronger, and therefore, you could see that those norms had greater retention compared to places like Skopje.
Great, thank you, Sukanya. One of the things that's come through in quite a few questions is how you tracked the population that you were trying to measure the impact of the intervention. How were you able to measure a population that seems to change quite a lot, particularly in contexts that have been affected by conflict?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we had to work around. So we were not looking in this project, it was not about looking at a project or looking at, whatever 10 to 100 people who had, been participants in that project, but it was looking at the different, the values underlying these different projects, right? So what were the ideas that were being transmitted by different projects? And then we were able to track and try and find some of the people who were part of it. Obviously, it was not foolproof in the sense, if you've had 50 participants for a particular interventions, we might have been able to just access 5. So I'm not saying that this is, completely representative, but it is also looking at these multiple projects and the multiple values, and at various points in time, how relevant are these? So when you have elections, people want to hear about, issues of transparency, accountability, what sort of leaders they want to have or want to elect. And this is reflected in terms of their voting behavior, in terms of voting participation. This is better reflected in terms of, in certain communities, for example, the same MP does not get voted twice. And we were able to track these and see, right, there was actually action following these messages being publicized through radio.
Great, thank you, Sukanya. The next question comes from Mindy Reiser. And Mindy writes, could you please say more about how you engaged parents in this process, or parental involvement? And also, how did you try to engage elders and community leaders in Macedonia and in Sierra Leone?
Okay. So I think in Macedonia, actually, parents were one of the population groups that were interviewed. So in addition to, obviously, these are very young children who are going to preschool education, and we were able to track some of the alumni, and also, through them, their parents, because I think the model was such that it was not only about intercultural, group socialization between the children, but with young children, as anybody who has children knows that it is very much based on friendships between parents as well, as to whether they are willing for their children to play together, or to attend each other's birthday parties, for example. So I think through the schools, through the teachers, we were able to track parents of alumni who had who had moved on, let's say, to primary and secondary school, and obviously they were recalling during the interviews, what they remembered of their time in Mosaic, what were the ideas that really remained with them. And one of the things was about, being patient, using polite words, not being violent. When you get angry, when children get angry, they hit and they can bite. But it was about, being able at that very young age, being taught to kind of use words instead of, physical sort of emotions, to being able to put them into words and say, I don't like this, this is not something that, you should do because I don't like it. So there was a way through which we could track. Obviously, not everybody, as I said, there was no big database that we could easily go to and say, right, 1,000 people, this is where they are located. No, it wasn't as simple. It was more about snowball sampling.
Great, thank you very much, Sukanya. Thank you, Mindy, for your question. The next question comes from Eddie Buranakul, and Eddie, apologies if I butchered your name. And Eddie asks, would you be able to suggest any platform that might be helpful to use to archive and share findings, achievements, etc.?
That's a really good question, Eddie. And I'm open to suggestions on this. I'm still yet to look into the, how do we digitize archives more carefully. This is just, one of the findings is that we should do this, but I will have to look into that more carefully. Sorry that I didn't have a straightaway answer. Maybe Jack will, I don't know.
Leave that with me, Eddie. I'll come back with an answer. If anybody in the audience has any insights, please feel free to share. So Kanya, let's go back to this idea of exit strategies. Is there any, have you come across anything which has been particularly successful? Have you seen any examples of INGOs exiting from a context like very successfully, and local organizations being able to take it on or sustain change? I just wonder if you could give any examples of that.
So I think, within this project, the Macedonia example is a very strong one, because the donor funding which they received from the beginning, the Swiss government had institutionalization or handover of the model to the Department of Education as the purpose. So they were very clear from the beginning that they were going to work very closely with the government, have their buy-in and do everything that was necessary to be able to, make this model work. So in some ways, when they had a firm, they didn't have a firm deadline, but progressively with funding cuts from the donors, it became inevitable that either you completely bin the model, which was difficult because it was so successful and had expanded to more than 18 different towns and locations with 1,000 sort of children enrolled in it. But more importantly, because of the positive feedback, that given a choice between the government's preschool format, which was called the public kindergartens, and the Mosaic format, which was initially donor funded, therefore private, but when it becomes institutionalized from 2012 onwards, and hats off to the staff in terms of their perseverance, the teachers who actually did not have pay for a couple of years because there was no donor funding, but the perseverance that this is the greater good for society, that we want this kind of intercultural bilingual instruction to work. But what is so in that sense, I think there's much to learn, that if you have a set purpose right at the beginning of a project, that at the end of the project, 10 years, 15 years, whenever, this is the end goal, that that we will give this over to whatever, the Department of Education or media houses or something, or a particular sort of Department of Finance. I'm sure there are different kinds of projects which come under the purview of peace building work, but I think it's really important to have that right at the beginning, and also have that as part of not only the project or the institution or the organization's perspective, but local staff are also aware of the fact, who are working with the organization, that that is the purpose. So I think that is a really strong, goal setting and can enable exit. But I think we need to be flexible in terms of timing exit, because it's not simply about the international actors. It's also about the locals and whether they are in a position to be able to manage on their own. And I think it has to be a mutually convenient exit plan.
Great, thank you for the detailed answers, Sukanya. And I guess my next point is, I want you to imagine that I am a massive peace building donor. I'm willing to fund a ton of work, and I'm only interested in short-term evaluation. I only want to find out the direct sort of outcomes of the projects that I'm funding right now, and how we made a change right away. If you were to make a pitch to me to fund evaluations, or to make a pitch to a donor to fund evaluations, post-closure evaluations, 5-10 years down the line, what would that pitch be?
I think that pitch would be, in terms of where the donor sees their overall contribution in a particular country, because they often work with multiple organizations, not just one peace building organization, and they have strategies to advance, let's say, democracy promotion or human rights, or, it's part of their government strategy. So I think there is more and more accountability being built into, for example, UK's DFID, in terms of how money is being spent and what the impact of that money is. And they're not interested only about a project. They want to look at, money spent over 5 years. And I think if they are to be answerable in terms of how they're spending public money, it's really important to build into their frame of thinking that we need to put aside enough funds so that we can revisit. And probably it has to be a donor funded effort, not only for one organization, but for multiple organizations, and in collaboration with organizations like the UN Peacebuilding Commission, for example, to look at that bigger, peace building work writ large, what has been the big wins in terms of what have we been able to change. For example, in certain countries, stable elections, post-conflict elections, 2 or 3 rounds of elections, 15 years after the war has ended, is a good indicator that, we have uptake in terms of democratic values. So that would be the pitch.
Yeah, and I think one of the sort of biggest points of optimism that I have is that as a field, we're getting better at monitoring our data and monitoring data within organizations. And as we get better at monitoring data and we're archiving this, we're creating databases which allows us to look back at our long-term impact. So that if there's a relatively long-term commitment, we should be able to see that behavioral change over time. But yeah, I think it does fall on donors, but it also falls on us to develop tracking systems and develop monitoring systems that allow us to do that. And
and just one more point, Jack, here. I think it's important within bigger peace building organizations who are committed to learning, like Search and several other partners, who are part of DMNE kind of forums. I think, or Alliance for Peacebuilding, for example. I think it's important for these organizations, it's not only about costing overheads, but also costing, things like money for doing these internal projects, where you can send your own institutional learning team out and look at, okay, 5 years down the line, we've been doing work on, let's say, gender. So
yeah,
it's not just looking at a project, but also the entire population of beneficiaries. And I think it's a simple thing, but it's maybe people are pressed for time, maybe people are moving jobs, maybe it's a combination of different factors. These are dynamic environments. But I think simple things like being able to keep the database and the follow-up with project sort of participants can be a key to having longitudinal data, which, unless you have that, how do you go back and track someone in some remote community, and people don't stay in the same place, people move. So I think making room for the fact that, there can often be a lack of, people don't stay in the same place, people will move. I think still having largely, workable data set in terms of who are the participants, where are they based, can we reach out to them if we need to. The simple steps like this can go a long way.
Yeah, I think two points on this. I think the first is that one of the reasons we don't have a common evidence base for peace building interventions is just the lack of long-term mapping and the lack of understanding long-term outcomes. And that often comes down to the fact that we don't have money to map these long-term outcomes. But we need to be more intentional about mapping this. My point, the point you mentioned about sort of the importance of archiving data, being able to reach out to previous participants, I think we would encounter some serious barriers to that, given data privacy considerations, particularly in Europe and the US. I know USAID just produced a new data guidance. We have GDPR in Europe. I think there's a fine line that we can track here, but it's definitely a challenge. I want to just make time for one last question from Liz McClintock, who writes, did you consider looking at Burundi for your research? It is an interesting example of a lot of deep investment in peace building that resulted in some improvement over 10 years, but is now seemingly regressing in terms of building peace.
So that's the other thing, expanding the evidence base. And I think with these two countries, I have been able to, come up with a framework through which I can compare more case studies. So I'm really happy about learning that, Burundi could potentially be another country, and even DRC, Congo, where there has been a lot of radio-based work similar to Sierra Leone. But we've seen in the DRC that, that peace has been very tenuous. But thank you for that.
Great. Well, thank you guys very much. Thank you, Sukanya, for being a wonderful host and providing us with a wealth of information here. I'm really looking forward to go back and listening to the recording because I'm sure there's a ton that I've missed out. And thank you to our audience for joining this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. Just a reminder, this recording will be posted on our media gallery later today, so please return to it, share it with your colleagues, and continue the discussion in the comments. We're going to be back next week, and I'm really excited about next week's webinar as a massive football or soccer fan. We're going to be discussing one of the most popular pieces of research produced in 2019, and that is the effect of Mohamed Salah on Islamophobia among Liverpool fans. As you may know, Liverpool just won the Champions League, so it should be a really interesting discussion, and we're welcoming the authors of that research from the Immigration Lab at Stanford to host the Thursday Talks next week. You'll have more information about that in your inbox tomorrow. But I just want to say again, thank you, Sukanya. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week and take care.
Take care now. Bye.